Thank you so much for having me back again. So what I'm going to do today is talk about bread in general and in particular. In case some of you are interested in baking yourselves, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about that and put it in historical context and talk about how wheat is grown, how it's milled, the baking procedures, and also sort of the culture around bread, why it's been so central to Western civilization. And what is particularly fascinating to me about this topic is that it's really the first time in human history, or meaning recorded what people thought, that bread is suspect. It's always been considered the staff of life, or the most nutritious food, the thing you should eat every day. And this is the first time that people are getting sick from it, having wheat allergens or gluten intolerance or celiac disease. And I think that that's really very interesting, and it's part of this whole story. I'm going to try to answer is why? Why is this suddenly happening? Was it just the people in the past died if they couldn't digest wheat? That's partly true. But it's also something else is different about our bread, the way it's made nowadays, the way it's milled, the way it's grown, chemical fertilizers, and I think even the way it's not really fermented very long. I think that's going to make a big difference. So I'm going to put my sort of money where my mouth is, I suppose, and say that also part of this is that as a food historian, you can read a lot about any topic, and find out about the social meaning of bread, why white bread was always more valued than dark bread, how it played a part in the Eucharist, obviously. I mean, there's all sorts of very interesting cultural things. And I can read about, even by the time you get to the 16th, 17th century, recipes and how, explicit instructions about how people made it. But I don't think you can really understand it unless you do it, unless you physically get your hands in and get dirty and really understand the physical process of it, and then of course taste it, which I think makes a very big difference in understanding why bread was so important and why it was central to food in the West, maybe up until right about now. And so let me start with my own experience, and let me also say what's kind of weird. As I've always been obsessed with bread. I mean, it's just one of those things that I eat every single day. I feel very bad in the morning if I wake up and I don't have something to do with bread or toast or something. I kind of let off of it a bit when I was working on noodles, and I thought, okay, I'm getting enough carbs. I don't eat bread and pasta every single morning for breakfast. So I stopped for a few years, but I'm kind of back into it now. So, and this, 2 weeks ago, Paul sent me a letter and said, can you bring a starter? And I said, yes, I'll start one right now. And it'll be ready in 2 weeks, and it'll be good to go, and you'll see, well, you'll taste. I brought that to eat, not just to show. But let me start with my own experience, just briefly. So what is kind of interesting, and I have no recollection of this, so I can't say that it informed my love of bread on any conscious level. But apparently I could not eat bread for the first several years of my life. I had celiac disease when I was born. At least this is what my mother told me. And she said, she always felt bad, everyone was eating bread, and I couldn't, and I lived on bananas, I guess, for the first 3 or 4 years of my life. And I don't know whether that sort of subconsciously, influenced my love of the stuff, but I think it must have on some level. But I've been baking for a long, long time. I mean, since I started cooking, I've been baking, with the little Fleischmann's yeast packets and using, all-purpose flour and the stuff that's mass-produced. And it makes an okay pizza. You can sort of bake, you can bake white bread with it, you can do other things. But it never really was great. Like, I never thought, okay, I love this bread that I bake. I never thought I did a better job than anyone professionally. It was just something you did, and so I got it in my head at one point. I was working on a series of little cookbooks about doing things that were difficult and dangerous and historical and things that people just don't do at home anymore. And this was before Nancy Silverton had come out with her book on sourdough. It was before Peter Reinhardt did even. So like sort of the big experts on sourdough, there was not a whole lot you could go by. And I thought, let me just see if I can follow the directions in an old text, for how you start it. And there's no directions, which kind of surprised me. I expected, to find some explicit technique. And all that it really involves is taking flour and water, mixing them together, and adding a little more every day. So of both. You have to use unchlorinated water, so the stuff from your tap doesn't really work. And it really works nicely if you start with a little whole wheat or maybe even some rye, but there's nothing to it. So people always say, oh, this sourdough's been in my family since 1864, or we carried it over the mountains, from the east. your sourdough is going to change, depending on, regardless. Wherever you take it, it's going to absorb the local bacteria, it's going to absorb whatever stuff is on the flour that you use. So it's really not a big deal. And I know this runs contrary to the whole idea that sourdoughs must be protected. In fact, I heard a story about a sourdough hotel, where people go away, they put their sourdough in this hotel, and it gets fed like a pet every day, and they play Mozart to it, I guess. But it's sort of, you know, there's nothing to it. The sourdough that I made, which I'll pass around in just a second, took 2 weeks exactly, and it's lovely. And she was born, I always refer to them as she, I'm not sure why, but on St. Agatha's Day. That was this past Thursday when she started bubbling and went crazy. You know, St. Agatha, who was a very unfortunate story, but she's the person you have, if you have breast trouble, you pray to St. Agatha because hers were removed by a Roman soldier. And she's always standing there with them on a plate, which is so bizarre. But I thought St. Agatha is a good name for her. So that's so, and so anyway, what I'm showing you here is actually Dartha. Durga. She was the first. She's an Indian goddess of destruction and rebirth. And I thought this is a wonderful name for sourdough. So anyway, I started this sourdough and I got it working. And what often puts people off is that within the first couple of days, the sourdough will go through what I like to call the vomit stage, because it actually smells like vomit. And everyone says, oh, this is awful, and they throw it away and they think it's going to poison them. No one has ever been poisoned by their sourdough starter. It's an impossibility. If it turned green and moldy, you would not use it, right? So, it's not, you can't accidentally harm yourself. But it does smell awful for a while, and then all of a sudden, the microbes in there start balancing off with the yeast in there. Remember, this is a whole symbiotic community in here. It's not just yeast from a packet, and there's nothing in there, but what was on the flour, what's on my hands, what's in the atmosphere, in my kitchen, and all that stuff happens entirely on its own. So it's not something you have to control, or you even need a recipe for. Some of the recipes have you throw away half of it and start, add more and measure and everything. You don't need to measure at all. You just add a little more every day, and it's perfectly fine. So in any case, let me talk just a little bit about the beauty of this from the microbial standpoint. You all know probably the human gut biome had just been, its DNA had been sequenced just a few years ago. And people have had a kind of intuition that the stuff that goes on in your stomach, the lactobacillus and things like that, and dozens of other things, it's not just lactobacillus, aid in your digestion. And they thought, okay, all the digestive problems we're having with modernity, 100 years ago, really had to do with the fact that we were not eating natural bacteria anymore. And this is, in the wake of Pasteur, so they could actually see them with microscopes and everything. And there were very interesting people who talked about this. Elie Metchnikoff was one who started to promote yogurt as a probiotic. That word really didn't exist before then. And people were starting to talk about naturally fermented bread, using whole wheat. This is in the wake of Sylvester Graham and John Harvey Kellogg, and people who were promoting health food being whole and natural, and this all sounds perfectly familiar to you, right? This is nothing strange. And but it was only very recently that they figured out that there are more cells in your stomach of the gut, the biome, the microbes. There's more of them than there are of us. And they have to do with our lymph system. There's what they call a gut brain that it's got all sorts of interesting things that it does in your body that if you ruin them or destroy them, you obviously get sick or you get stomach upsets. But other things happen long term that they're just beginning to figure out. So I'm talking not about having your yogurt every day with lactobacillus or something in it. I'm talking about safe versions of E. coli, leuconostoc. There's maybe a dozen or 2 dozen different things, depending on where you are, that are going to go into your sourdough. And it's why also the sourdough that's in the Bay Area, where it's cold and foggy, is very, very different from what happens in Stockton, and I'm guessing also from Livermore. It's just too hot here. So you get different varieties. We don't get a sour flavor as they do there. The San Francisco version, it actually exists all around the world. It's not unique there, but it's very, very different. And I did this as an experiment when I was doing a little cookbook. A friend and my co-author and I used the exact same water bottled, the exact same flour, the exact same baking technique and everything. Her bread looked completely and utterly different from mine. And it was just, she had different bacteria living there. And so, in any case, let me also talk just a little more about the microbes themselves. We have had, I would say since about the late 19th century, and most people, we're not talking about Kellogg's and Graham's, but most people have this attitude toward microbes that they are germs, that they should all be killed because they're all dangerous and just wipe them off the face of the earth and we'll all be happy. And the idea was that, some of them are pathogenic and they just discovered these, right? They just, in the history of medicine, it's obviously breakthroughs, Robert Koch and finding vaccines and all this stuff happens late 19th century, but the discovery of vitamins happens at the same time, and they just didn't think microbes were good for you. So we developed pasteurization for much of our food. We developed antibacterial soaps and things that we just thought, just kill them all. And it's a kind of speciesism, really, if you think about it that way, right? And we didn't have any inkling that our body needs them, that they're sort of, part of what we need in our, we live in a kind of symbiosis with these creatures, if you want to think of it that way. And more importantly, we weren't thinking that they impart flavor to so many things that we find important. Wine, bread, cheese, cured meats, pickles. There's a whole range of things that we depend on bacteria and molds, mold in, for koji mold, for example, or blue cheese, that's penicillium, and also funguses, right? Yeast is a fungus. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is one of my favorite words. It just means sweet fungus of mushrooms. Sweet mushroom fungus, something like that. So just again, this is a symbiosis of these two things. So let me pass it around, just so you can take a whiff of her. She's very nice and very strong. Surprisingly, it smells just a little bit sour, but it's yeast and whatever else was living in my kitchen at the time. So I got it in my head as a historian that, so what happened is I baked with a sourdough starter, and it was like all of a sudden a revelation. I said, I can't believe I can do this at home, and it worked. And I had, a pizza stone in the oven, and I had a peel so I could slide it in, all the sort of standard equipment. It's not really complicated at all. You can just put it on a baking tray. It's not a big deal. But the bread was just so incomparably different from what I'd always made. Partly, I think, because one, there's a whole lot more going on in there. When you bake with a Fleischmann's packet, there's no bacteria. But it's also because it takes much longer to go. So when I made this bread yesterday, I started about 3 yesterday, mixed it full, kneaded it up, let it raise, and then knocked it down about 3 hours later, and then put it in what's called a broad form mold. So it's this sort of basket that has these rings in it. Put it in there, and it rose from about 5 till about 6 this morning when I baked. So it was 13, 14 hours, and then, well, even more than that from the start. So that's very different. It breaks down the proteins, it changes the structure of the glutens, it does something very different. So you get much different shape of holes inside, it steams from within in a very different way, and you'll see the texture is just nothing like what you can do without using the bacteria. In a sense, they pre-digest the proteins, and I think that's one of the pieces of this larger puzzle that I'm going to suggest, is that our bread is very different now, because we use just yeast, one strain, one very, very powerful one. In fact, the rapid rise stuff, your bread will be done in an hour, rise in 40 minutes even, less than that. So, anyways, let me bring you more to my experience specifically. So I thought, if I'm going to do this correctly, I can't use modern equipment. I can't use all this stuff that everyone's, because I'm never really going to get a sense of what historian, as a historian, what I would learn. So let me just quickly show you what I did. It is kind of crazy, but I'll walk you through it. So these are some of the early breads that I came out with. The one I made now is the same shape as this one, just you can't see it here. It's a broad form, but then you slice through the top of it. You use what's called a lame, which is this lame, which is this thing. It's just a little sharp knife. Sometimes they're a razor, sometimes other, but this just sort of slices any star patterns. And that, when you put it in the oven, it allows the bread to rise up. I actually throw ice cubes in my oven also, because that gives it steam, so it replicates a steam oven. And it gets a nice crust, as you'll see in just a moment. This is another one I just sliced in a different way, but you can see the patterns are just pretty, and it gets a really nice texture and everything from it. So So let me tell you what I decided to do. One day I thought, okay, I really need a bread oven. And to buy one, to have one built cost about $10,000. I wasn't gonna do that. And I thought I could probably make one. And have you ever seen that scene in what is it, the Close Encounters, where the guy goes outside, it's a, what's his name, Richard Dreyfuss goes out and starts molding the dirt. That's what I felt like, okay? And I thought, okay, I have a pottery kiln in the basement, so why not just make one? I can make the bricks, I can put this together on my own. And I came up with the very stupid idea, now in retrospect, I think it was stupid, that I would put down some cinder blocks and then lay a platform of clay and cover it with sand, which you'll see in a moment, and then disassemble the whole thing, cut it into parts, fire it, and then reassemble it like a stonemason. I didn't realize masonry is a lot harder than you think. Laying cement is just very difficult. So anyway, I'll just show you what I did. I numbered them so I could remember what order to put them back into, and of course you run out of numbers and letters, and eventually I went to Greek, and then I realized upside down some of the ones look the same. It's really stupid, okay? But anyway, I put sand on top, so that would give me the structure of the beehive, right? It kind of looks like an orno. That's the way they would have made it, you know, in colonial times. And then that's what it looked like after I put clay around the whole thing. I made an opening out of a ridge, and this is all clay. And then that's the door after I added the door on. And then that's the bricks in my basement, you know, laid out before firing. That's firing them. So I thought they would go back perfectly. They should have. They did. But in any case, I don't know why this sliced bread is right here. But the upshot of it is the interior. The funny part was I didn't realize that the sand would stick to the mortar, and then when you fire it, it would fall down. So the first couple of pizzas and stuff I made in there, they were sandy. It's crunchy sand on the bottom. But in the end, it actually worked. Okay, I could get this thing up to about 600 degrees. You know, you don't want it to be really hot because then you burn everything to a crisp, but it's hotter than a regular oven. And of course the method is kind of fun. So what I've discovered from this is you make a fire in there, and then you scoop everything out, all the ashes, you let the whole thing heat up, and then you mop it, so that creates the steam that you would have had otherwise. And then you put the bread in and close it up. And there's I put a chimney on the back of this. I don't think I needed to do that, but I did. And then it stays hot for about another 12 hours. So you can put a casserole in, you can bake another bread, you can keep going. And it's small. It was only like, you know, a circumference like this. So it was made for one bread, really. That's it firing. And it was nice, you know. So anyway, so then I got this idea in my head, well, it's sort of okay, but I'm using commercial flour. I'm gonna have to grow some wheat. And so I did in the buckets in my backyard. And this was a very specific antique strain. And I can't explain how this happened. I was on a farm in Finland, and they were talking about their unimproved strains from the 18th century. And I said, okay, can I have some of this? And they said, yeah, just take whatever you want as you walk along. So we're walking through the fields, my pockets were full, and yes, I had to smuggle it home, but this is not legal. But planted it, and I had maybe, I don't know, a quarter, half a pound of grain from the whole process, and planted it in the backyard. It grew up beautifully. I had I had a little sickle that I cut it with. I threshed it with my flail, like an ancient Egyptian would do, and I got about a quarter pound of wheat back. So it's really very stupid again, but at least I did it. I had the experience, and I did actually take the process from growing from seed all the way through to baked bread in the oven. So at least I know what it was like. It was a lot of labor to get one loaf. And I have a hand kern, that's actually my son's hand, so I ground it all myself too. And I use this every now and then still. It's, which is fun. And I got some decent breads out of this. I mean, I can't complain at all. It's just not something you do every day. But in the past, people did not grow the stuff. And it was a different person milling it. It was usually a different person baking it. It was separated. One person wouldn't take this all the way through. And of course, they also knew what they were doing. So that makes a big difference. I just put these in here because I taught a class in Oakland with children. They did such a beautiful job. I brought sourdough, we baked on spot, and they were just making all these cool shapes. And I just found the pictures the other day, so I thought, let me share these. I don't know, these little kids made these. So that's where the history comes in. let me also say that at some point, I don't know how this happened, but I got known as being a baker and being very good at this. And so if you're interested, do people know who Nathan Myhrvold is? He's a billionaire who used to be one of the directors of Microsoft. And he retired and he decided that he wanted to play around in the kitchen, among other things. He's hired me basically to write the history volume of his modernist bread. So I ghostwrote it, don't tell anyone, So that's where this whole thing comes from, what I'm about to say. It's not, I didn't write it all for this, although I love you people, but it's like 100,000 words of history. So let's start at the beginning. And let's start with the idea first of where wheat comes from. Now we have this idea. It comes from the Fertile Crescent, so it's this area that is basically Eastern Turkey, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, all the way down to Israel. And then it's a nice little crescent that then was very fertile. It's not all fertile today, and wheat grows wild there. And we have this idea, it's of course comes from the people who are on paleo diets, that when we evolved, we did not have wheat as part of our diet because that's a domestic species. And so people should get rid of grains and just eat protein as our hunter and gatherer ancestors did. It's a complete fallacy. People definitely ate grains. They gathered it wild. They pounded it in big rocks, grinding stones like you'll see in Indian Rock Grinding Stone State Park. So it's not like it was not the major part of our diet, but people definitely ground grains 50,000 years BC. So it's long before domestication. Now what domestication does change it a lot. And here, I'll just pass these around. This is wheat that I actually bought this in Alaska. It was really good wheat. But anyway, what happens is probably people started gathering wheat from the hillsides, still grows wild there, and brought it back to their houses, and it got wet and sprouted, and maybe they were keeping it in pits underground. We don't really know how this happened. No one woke up one day and said, honey, let's domesticate wheat. It was not a conscious decision at all. But what happened is they started bringing the stuff closer and closer to their houses and planting it. And as anyone who farms knows and keeps seed, you keep the one that is the biggest and the nicest and the one that has the largest, what historians call the seed yield ratio, meaning the number of kernels that grow on every stalk. Ancient grains like Triticum monococcus, you get one. So, Triticum speltum, you get a handful. There's a handful of ancient ancestors of modern wheat. That what they would do is they'd pick the ones that were bigger, that had more kernels, that wouldn't flop over. Think of this, in nature, it naturally grows really tall, and so it falls over, goes in the mud, and replants itself, right? Makes a whole lot of sense. Humans don't want that, so we want to grow it shorter so it's sturdier, doesn't flop over, doesn't dehisc, meaning the seed doesn't go and fling the seed out. So there's all sorts of weird things that the early Neolithic farmers would have chosen for to make sure that they could harvest the grain and keep it. And in doing so, every year, the crop changed just a little, just a little, just a little. And what happened is really strange, and this is, people tend to think of species as these very distinct units that have nothing to do with other species. They don't mix, they don't cross with microbes. We know they can borrow DNA from other microbes and change entirely. That's how life probably began. What's weird about wheat is it can cross with other species. So Triticum crossed with Igalops, and it got, somehow, it's hexaploid, which means it has 6 copies of 7 chromosomes. It has 42 chromosomes in it. It's a really weird plant in that respect. And what happened is when it made this cross, it was a mutant, and it suddenly developed this stuff called glutenin and gliadin, and those things that allow the proteins to form these chains, allow them to form pockets in there. And so wheat is kind of very unusual in that respect. Corn is also very, very unusual, so is rice. But they can be staples because they have that high percentage of protein. The stuff that I use, gosh, it's 12.7%, something like that. I mean, it's really, you can live on wheat, and that's the good part, that's the bad part also. Because once wheat is domesticated, it takes a lot more labor to grow wheat than it does to hunt and gather. you have a lot less free time. It's not quite as nutritious and varied as a hunting and gathering diet. So what's really interesting is our hunting and gathering ancestors were probably about 6 feet. The agriculturalists were 5'5" or so. They're a little shorter than me, which is the height just goes down immediately. They're not as well nourished. They have cavities in their teeth, which hunter and gatherers never do. They had problems also because, you know, when you become sedentary, you live in one place, all of your garbage stays there, your physical waste, everything goes in pits. You get diseases of civilization, and including living around animals. There are a lot of diseases that can mutate and suddenly become, human diseases also. Flu is one of those, but it still happens today. So there's a lot we paid for having bread, but the idea is that it's one of the few grains in the world that you can actually live on. Corn is one, also maize, rice is one, teff in Africa, sweet potatoes, potatoes themselves. So there are other crops like that, but among grains, it's really weird. There's another argument among historians, was it bread first or beer first? Because clearly they're very similar processes, very similar yeast, very similar fermentation. They probably go hand in hand. And if you see any ancient Egyptian or Sumerian texts, it's all about beer. I mean, they're really into beer. So how did they actually, so you have this new kind of wheat. Let's talk about how it was processed. So to start, they had something that's sort of like a Mexican metate. It's a saddle quern. So you can imagine a big sort of trough and a long stone, and you're literally crushing it by hand, dry. It's a lot of labor, or pounding it. You could put it in a stone with a big pounder and go like this. It's very inefficient. One person has to do that several hours a day. In fact, the one that I had there, it wasn't that hard, but it was, that's a rotary quern. It's a little easier because you're actually going around like this. It has a dome in the middle. One set of grooves goes one way, one goes the other way. So you just feed into the top, and it grinds it, and it comes out the bottom. It's a basic grinding principle to this day, but it took me maybe 45 minutes to grind a pound of flour. So that's a lot of labor added to make, that's a several pound loaf. That would take a couple of hours to grind that much grain. So the real key in the ancient world to changing all of this is figuring out how to hook draft animals up to it. And what I find fascinating is there are some parts of the world where they do have them, some where they don't. Obviously, you need domesticated animals. You have to kind of luck out in having beasts of burden. You need, a turkey may be very nutritious in the New World, but it's not going to pull a plow or move a grindstone. So basically, it's just imagine that little hand quern rotary quern that I showed you, attaching an enormous lever to it, having it be an enormous thing, and just hooking an oxen up to it. The oxen will happily turn around and around, and they're castrated, so they're very happy, and they're docile. They're not like bulls. So draft animals are very important to this, and I think the oven technology is important also. Let me show you. Let me get back to this. So this is an actual loaf of bread from Pompeii. You all know what happened in 79 AD. Pyroclastic flow, everything is burnt and just frozen in time, including a bakery where these breads were in the oven, and they charred immediately and they're preserved. I saw this, it came to an exhibit in London a few years ago, and I went to see it and looked very closely, and I thought, I need to figure out how this was made. And I think the vast majority of people who talk about this have no clue how it was made, because I want you to just look at a couple of features closely. You'll see there's a stamp on it. They did that to regulate the size and the price, and if it was underweight or bad for some reason, that person could get arrested. So it's a label, like a nutrition label. But there's like a waist around the whole thing, and there's also these marks that go across and a little disc hole in the center. And people always say, well, this is called panis quadratus, meaning that they would break off a piece and sell it. And people always said, well, they put a string around the middle, and then they scored it with a knife, and then they baked it that way. Now, first of all, you'd have to take the string off, which would mean it would burn in the oven, right? That's a bad idea. The other thing is, if it were actually a string, you would see the marks of the cord. And in fact, that's a technique in pottery, where you put a string around the thing, and you get this beautiful little hatch marks. There's no such hatch mark on this. It's completely clean around. And the other curious thing is if you had a knife and you were cutting the indentations, there wouldn't be that disc in the middle. So what I think they had was something like a wheel, a stamp. I think that what they did is they put these in clay pots, like a flat casserole. They turned them out, which is why it's wider on the bottom than the top. Then they took this stamp and they went, and it's got an axle in the middle, and then spokes on the outside, and it makes the indentation to sell. So that's the only way I could figure out. And I did this 2 summers ago with a class outside of Rome, and we used a Roman oven, and we used the local flour, and we made one of these things, and it looks almost exactly like this. So I think that's what's going on. The other weird thing is it's spelt. It's a tight, it's a slightly different species, but very, very nice. If you were in Egypt at the time, you'd be using emmer, which you can find also in health food stores. The kind of wheat we use, red winter wheat, is totally a modern thing. So let me talk about, so this is Ostia. This is right outside of Rome, and we went to a bakery where they have these are enormous mills. And you can see that there's a big, you can't see the cone inside, but the top part is a big piece of stone that goes on top. You can see where the, I've got a pointer, why don't I use that? You can see right there, a big stick comes out this way, and you can see an animal, a draft animal, will walk around, and all the grain that comes out, will come right through here and be collected somehow. And this is 1, 2, 3, there may be a dozen in here, and the remnants of ovens and everything. So clearly, the Roman world, bread was the staple, and they produced it in enormous, enormous quantities. They grew it in enormous quantities. They actually had slaves to farm what's called a latifundia. And this is a commercial operation, but it's also a state-run operation, meaning that they would supply the army with this bread, they would, with grain, and would be baked somewhere else. But on a scale that is unfathomable in the ancient world for the amount of bread that they used. And you probably also know, well, here's a bread cellar, right? This is the exact same breads that I just showed, the panis quadratus, that is in a fresco of the guy handing them out and selling them, and he's obviously got a whole mess of them. So you probably also know the Romans had a form of social services. They handed out bread, basically. And anytime anyone was going to, threaten rebellion or be a little dangerous, they would just hand out more bread and have more chariot races. So the ancient satirist Juvenal said the Roman people, all they really want is bread and circuses. Meaning a circus is not clowns. It's it's a circuit. It's the chariot races, and that they're just stupid. Just keep handing them bread, and they'll be perfectly happy. So bread is central to the whole thing. While I'm on this, also let me mention that the Egyptians had bread too. They baked it quite differently. They baked it in what looked like flower pots, and then you didn't need an oven actually. You could just pile these all up and build a fire around it, and the heat from the ceramic would cook the bread, and you just turn it out. And they would put dates in there or honey, and some of those are actually people are buried with them as mummies. So just a different kind of bread entirely. But let me get back to Rome. What is amazing about the Romans, and talking about the scale of the bread that they made. This is in Barbagal. It's outside of the city of Arles. I think it's Arles. And there are, I think, 16 separate mills set up along a race that could put out something like 4.5 tons of flour a day, meaning that this is an enormous operation. But I want to direct your attention to the technology, because it's kind of interesting. This is just about when it's invented. It's a water wheel. Okay, so the idea is that you either put your mill up against the stream, or you have a course, meaning directing the water. If you use an aqueduct, this one actually does, directs it from the stream down this aqueduct, and then it falls onto a big wheel that has these buckets on it. And as it hits the bucket, of course, it pushes it down, and it's a constant flow. This turns the wheel this way. This turns an axle. This turns a grindstone. So we're talking a much bigger scale now, much more than an animal can do. You're talking, satchels and satchels of wheat all the day. that could feed. Arles was a pretty big city at the time, but also they exported this stuff. They could make tons of flour. And I want to just sort of talk for a second about how, think of how the scale, not just the scale of operation, but who owns the means of production here. It started with one person in their household grinding, then it went up to an draft animal in a village producing for them, and now we're at a whole empire producing on what is really an industrial scale. And of course, who owns the mill is the important part. Who has the money to invest in the bakery? Who has it's a very different kind of economy on this scale. So let's go to the just a couple more things. This is called a klibanis. So people did bake at home too. We have this idea that you can only bake if you have a big oven and access to an enormous bakery. This is a small clay thing. You put the bread inside and the dome on top, you put it in the oven, and then you put coals on top. So it's kind of like a Dutch oven. You can bake bread in this fine, or a testa is what it's often called. Like a testudine is the word for tortoise, right? So it kind of looks like a tortoise. So let's go on to the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages is a very different place, partly because, well, the first half of the Middle Ages, at least, the Roman Empire falls apart, and people go back to eating wild food. Actually, the latifundia fall apart, bread becomes much less important in the whole diet in general. But if you lived in a place where you could grow wheat, now remember there's rye in the north, there's barley, you can make bread out of barley, it's not great, but it's there. There's oats you can make into cakes. But in general, the only people who had the means to grind and bake and mill and bake are people who own land, who are the lords. And in fact, the word in Anglo-Saxon, well, I can't remember the etymology of lord, but lady comes from hlafdein, which means the loaf giver. Okay, so she was the person who had the loaves. If you were, wanted to be protected by her or work for her, you'd go to the lady of the house, would be the person who had control of the bread. Okay? And I think that kind of prefigures what would happen in feudalism later, is that in order to get protection, people would farm in a totally different pattern than the ancient Romans, is that people were not slaves, but they were bound to the soil, meaning that they had a kind of contract with the owner, that they would work a couple of days a week on the lord's own plot of land, his demesne, and then they could farm the rest of the time and eat or sell or do whatever they wanted with the produce they made themselves. But it means that that kind of agriculture means that it's entirely local. It's very subsistence agriculture. They're not going to sell this far abroad because the Roman roads have fallen apart, the markets don't exist anymore. So in that kind of agriculture, you don't experiment. You don't try new techniques or experiment with new crops, because if it fails, you starve. Okay? So this is a very, very backward, very traditional kind of agriculture that plays it safe all the time. And I think another reason that it happens is that, remember, every time you want something milled, the lord of the place owns the mill. You have to take it to him or to a miller and pay them to do that, and you get the bread back, you get the flour back. And usually there's also a communal oven, meaning that one person can't afford to have an oven, you have one for the whole community, everyone puts a loaf in, puts their own stamp on, and takes it home with them. So what happens, what's different about the early half of the Middle Ages and the latter half, is about the year 1000, there is a wave of global warming. And we're all worried about global warming basically because we're doing it, we're causing it ourselves. But then it was a natural thing. There's an enormous warm period after about the year 1000. The evidence is really pretty striking. You could grow grapes in northern England. They take cones of ice out of the Arctic, and they find all sorts of pollen from flowers and things that would never appear there now, although they're starting to now again. But in any case, the whole world gets warmer, the population of Europe booms, and suddenly everything is intensified. The level of baking becomes a commercial operation again, but a small, not on an imperial scale, but in a local scale. And the very interesting thing is not only water mills, they proliferate all over the place. Every stream, will have mills along it, but now windmills also, which is a slightly different technique. I mean, you've all seen windmills, but that's actually a mill. Any place it's windy, you catch the wind to drive your wheel, and you use it. The level of legislation regarding bread starts to increase. In England, for example, they have what's called the assize of bread. And the government was sort of worried that, wait, if there's a low crop one year, that means the price of the bread will go up, and then the poor people won't be able to afford it. They're going to starve, and they're going to revolt against me, right? Remember, the king doesn't have a whole lot of power. So what he did was adjust the price of the bread so that it would always be affordable, and so that the bakers and the farmers would actually get enough so that they could live also. So it's kind of, we tend to think government control of the supply and demand of grain is a very modern thing. It's not at all. The assets of bread is from the 12th century all the way through the 19th century, basically fixing prices so people could afford it. So let me take you, so this is an illustration that's at the Getty, and they asked me to do a little blog about explaining it. What I think is actually happening here, there's some things that are correct, but some that just make no sense. I don't think the illustrator actually knew how to bake bread. For one, you don't put dough on the floor. It's clearly all over the place. The other is that you wouldn't start baking with the flames pouring out. I think that's just sort of an illustration. You wait till the flames are gone and your bread burns up. The shape of the oven is completely wrong. The hole has to be 2/3 the height of the dome that you actually have. So this looks like this is totally weird comical thing. I don't think he really knew. But the guy with the bread in the trough, I think he's supposed to be kneading it or something. Or actually, the word is actually breaking. I know this sounds kind of weird. We tend to think you knead bread, but what you're doing is you're squashing with all your strength into the bread and then folding it over and doing it again. Same for noodles. It's called to break. And if you have a long stick, you connect that to the wall and you let the stick do it, or you sit on it sometimes. And for doing large amounts of bread, that makes a lot more sense. The thing is called a break. So I thought I would show you just a couple of the recipes. So here's a bread baker from the 17th century. It's just the best illustration. Bread bakers would have a horn. There's usually someone blowing a horn there to tell people, come and get your bread, it's done. But I think the variety of shapes, he's got pretzels there, and she has what looks like a Dutch baby or something like that. It looks like a pancakes sort of thing. But there's a bread there that looks not unlike the one I have here. And some long breads and rolls, and I think I have another. Yeah, there's the guy blowing his horn, and you can see the bread is very similar to the one I'll open in a moment. So this one I had to show you just because it's the weirdest painting I've ever seen in my life. It's called The Bakers of Eeklo. And what I think what's happening is that people would come who decided they didn't like their looks or their heads, so they come in and they take their heads off and put a cabbage there while they waited, and then they rebake them. They put them in the oven and then put their heads back on, and then people left and said, well, this was not so good. And so I think it's a moral lesson that you should be happy with the face you're given. But what's interesting is you can see the oven, the peel that he's putting it in on. You can see all this sort of bread stuff going on in the background with heads instead of dough. So I thought it's just, in this many versions of this, it's just such a weird painting that I had to show you. So, okay. This is the painting of the harvest by Peter Bruegel in the 16th century. This is what he's really depicting here is a world that was disappearing. It's very nostalgic. It looks sort of fondly at the peasants who are sitting down. One guy in the hat is sort of eating a piece of toast, looking directly at you. This person is cutting a piece of cheese, and they're drinking, whatever. But it's I think that kind of world is, when he painted this, was rapidly disappearing as agriculture was becoming commercialized. People were making more for the market. This is a feudal scene, obviously. They're just peasants who are harvesting the grain and will use it themselves. They'll mill it and bake bread themselves. So I wanted to show you that. But completely everything changes when we get to the modern era. Actually, let me share with you one little recipe. I thought it was right in there, but I have a recipe. Nope, I must have forgotten it. From Hugh Platt. So just so you know, there are recipes from the 17th century. This is a manuscript written by a guy who was known for writing about confectionery. But he gives you a complete and utter recipe, and it's one of the things that I've followed in trying to bake bread. So for the baking of bread and of your simple meals, your best principle is manchet, which you bake in this manner. First, your meal being ground upon stones, if it's possible, which makes the whitest flour and bolted through the finest bolting cloth. I haven't talked about that, but when you first do it, you pass it through a cloth so it comes out really, really fine. Put into a kimnel and opening the flour in the midst, the kimnel's a big trough, put in the best ale barm, the quantity of 3 pints to a bushel of meal. And why I'm sharing this is what he's using is not a sourdough starter, it's actually yeast. It's just pure yeast that he's scooping off the top of a beer batch. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, right? Sweet fungus of beer. And that's what you buy when you buy the little packet. So that's the change, I think, in baking. And then put it in reasonably warm, knead it with both hands through the break, that's that big thing that squashes it, or fold it in a cloth and use your feet to tread it. You can also do it with your feet if you want, I've never done that, but let it lie an hour to swell, then take it forth and mold it into manchets, that's just a standard white bread. Round and flat, scotch it to let it rise, prick with your knife, put it in the oven and bake. So it was the exact same procedure that I did. But let's get to the modern world. So this is a guy named Oliver Evans who decided in the year 1790 that he would automate the entire process of milling, meaning no human hands ever touch this stuff. It's an experiment. The site actually still exists. It's outside of Newcastle, Delaware. If you ever go to the Hagley Museum, that's right in that same area in Delaware. But the idea was the guy just pressed the button and the whole thing, there's various stages, and this doesn't actually last. I mean, this is not the technology that everyone uses in the long run. It costs more to maintain it than it does to just hire someone. But the one that does is this. As you probably know, if you are a miller, you have to have good wind or good water, meaning you're very limited to where you can be. If you're in the hinterland in the mountains, you just don't get milled flour. This invention was built by James Watt, who you know from the steam engine, right? And Matthew Boulton, and this is called Albion Mills. This is just about the same time as Oliver Evans' experiment. The only difference is this uses steam power to run the mill. And apparently this was described by Erasmus Darwin, who's Charles Darwin's grandfather, as the most powerful machine he had ever seen or that ever existed on Earth. It could turn out 72 tons a day of flour, compared to what 4 of the ancient Romans were doing. This is much, much more. It's on the south side of the Thames in London. Albion is the ancient word for England, right? So this thing started cranking out tons and tons of flour. And apparently the millers in the neighborhood decided that this was going to put them out of work, and they burned it down. And the poet Robert Southey was standing there as all of this happened, saying they're dancing in the streets, and clearly, it was just a weird time in period, kind of like the Luddites, who broke the machines. They thought we were going to put them out of business. But the most fascinating part about this whole story is the guy who lived right down the street from this was William Blake. So if you know the song that's the national hymn of Britain, you know that song, and did those feet in ancient time walk up on England's mountains green? There's a line in there of the dark satanic mills that describes this. It's exactly what he was talking about. And they burned. So anyway, listen to the hymn, it's beautiful. So what happens, they build other ones, of course, right? the automation and steam power means you can put a mill absolutely anywhere. And along with other things in the Industrial Revolution, especially canals at first, in the US they connect the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, meaning that, and the development of hard red winter wheat, which actually comes from Russia, they start planting in the Midwest. And it means Minneapolis becomes the milling center. To this day, 99% of all the wheat milled in General Mills is there, and all the other big Pillsbury are, I think Pillsbury's there too, but Minneapolis becomes the milling center for the whole United States because of the canals, and the railroads, and the shipping from the Midwest there. So it just changes the nature of who grows the stuff, how it's processed, technical innovations in farming, obviously the mechanized reaping, the McCormick reaper, mechanized systems of plowing and harvesting, and you probably also know the name Benjamin Holt. There's a Ben Holt Drive in Stockton. Anyway, he invented the Caterpillar tread, so the tractors wouldn't sink into the mud, which we would have had before all the controlling of the waterways and everything. So a whole slew of technical innovations meant that grain could be grown on a much larger scale. And you might know also the Sperry Mills, which is also in Stockton, was the largest miller on the West Coast. This was, the whole entire Central Valley was grain to start with. And then what gets discovered is a handful of other things. One is steel rollers, so that you can actually process much quicker. You don't get grit in your flour. It's much more, it doesn't wear out like a stone does. And it heats the flour just a little, so you're destroying some of the nutrients. You probably know in the US, we, by law, have to put the nutrients back in if you buy it. So it's fortified with riboflavin and thiamine, stuff like that. We also decided that, up until about the, I would say, 60s or 70s, white bread was always the ideal. You wanted your bread as light and white as possible. And that happens if you age your flour, if you let it sit around. Now, if you're investing in this, you don't want to have your stuff sitting around, so they started adding bromates and bleach and things to make it whiter. They started different milling techniques to take away more of the chaff, to remove the germ, because you all know the germ on there will go bad. So that's why your whole wheat, you should keep it in the fridge or use it quickly. They remove that, and then they're giving you just the carbohydrate starch inside the kernel and making it whiter. And these types of wheat that are grown, the hard red winter wheat has much more protein, so it's a totally different thing that's grown in Europe. Okay, in Europe the bread maybe has 9 or 10%. This is way up to like 12, sometimes 13% protein, especially if you're using bread flour. And then, of course, Pasteur comes in with the discovery of microbes and pasteurization and all that, but they can identify yeast. And within a decade or so, there is Fleischmann's yeast, 1858. You can buy the stuff. It's fresh cakes to start with, but then they're selling it as health food. That's kind of amazing. They advertise that you should eat 3 cakes a day. Keep one in your desk at work and eat the yeast. It's just like, what is going on? Yeast is not. I mean, I guess you can still buy brewer's yeast. People think it's good for you, but that's who started it. Very earlier, the other thing, which I won't go into, but I think it's an interesting part of the whole thing, is chemical leaveners also become popular. They're invented in the 18th century, starting with things like pearl ash, but eventually bicarbonate of soda, and then baking, not just baking soda, but baking powder, which has aluminum sulfate and other things in it. But it means that quick breads, are totally, it takes no time at all. The chemical reaction of the acid kneading the base causes bubbles, carbon dioxide, and it lifts it. You don't need yeast at all. And the other thing, which is a long story, is that because of capitalism comes in, Adam Smith writes in 1776, and then when you get to the 19th century, most states, Western Europe and the US, think we shouldn't control industry. Let them do what they want and let them make money, and if we meddle with their business, we're all gonna, they won't make so much money. So there were no food purity laws up until the early 20th century. And in fact, if you want to read a great book, the story of Harvey Wiley, called The Poison Squad, I just finished reading it. It's great. Just came out. But it's about food purity. It's the age of muckraking, and Upton Sinclair's features in it. It's a really interesting book. But the point is, you could put anything in flour. You could put clay. You could put just anything to make it lighter up until the early 20th century. And while all this was happening, I think that's the only way to understand people like Kellogg, William Harvey Kellogg, who said we should eat whole wheat, it should be fresh baked, it should have no chemical leavener or additives or colorings or things, is that whole idea of natural food comes from the fact that what everyone was eating was really, really bad or dangerous. The milk supply was dangerous. I mean, everything was. So, the course of the 20th century, as you know, the technology kept going. The whole green revolution, the United States basically became the breadbasket for the world. We invented sliced bread. It was the best thing. Nothing is as good as sliced bread, right? So, Wonder Bread. This is actually Wonder. It's called Wonder Cut. And the interesting thing that happened in my mind is that for all history, the lighter and more finely processed you could have your bread, the better, the more expensive it was. The cheaper stuff had rye mixed in, or it was less finely milled, whatever. And with the appearance of Wonder Bread, it switches that completely opposite. Is that the Wonder Bread becomes the really cheap stuff because it's made industrially, and then there's the artisanal loaf, which is handmade and has all the wheat germ in it, and someone has put in a fire and has kind of reinvented the whole idea of what bread used to be like. And I'm always amazed that people think a ciabatta must be a really old Italian bread. It was invented in the 20s. A baguette, that's the French have always been eating baguettes. It's a totally modern thing. It's much of the bread that you eat now really is an imagined version of what would have been eaten in the past, but it does use commercial, by and large, it uses commercial, standard ovens, steam injection, things like that, and very controlled yeast. Some bakers, if you go to Tartine, then yes, they're using a sourdough. They're really doing it for real. But by and large, it's very controlled. And I've always wondered, if you've seen the boudin, the sourdough from San Francisco, we have one in Stockton. And I always wondered, wait a minute, if they're doing this, they bring that starter over to Stockton, it's going to change immediately. It's much hotter. It's going to kill off their bacteria. I think they must bring the frozen dough and just bake it here, or move it very quickly before it changes. And then, the oddest part of this whole story is the backlash, is all of a sudden people are having wheat and gluten intolerance and getting sick from it and deciding to cut out all carbs. And part of me, no one has been able to prove this, okay? There is research going on, but the intuition, let me say, is that a lot of people say, we go to Europe and have no trouble eating their bread. They ferment it properly, they bake it longer, they don't use the same chemical fertilizers and conditioners and things that we use in this country, and bread is made differently there. And it's really only in the US that this is a problem. And this all the parts kind of came together for me. This young woman contacted me, who was a student of Michael Pollan's, and she said, I'm making a film about bread. Can I walk through the whole process with you from beginning to end? And I said, sure. And it's a fun little film. Michael Pollan's in it also. And in fact, a lot of the information he put in his book on quotes, which I think he took from her. But anyway, it just kind of all those parts came together in my mind, that bread has nothing to do with what it was like in the past. If it's grown differently, it's milled completely differently, even if you're using a really great flour, like this is King Arthur, it's just the easiest for it to use, milled totally differently. It's not fermented as long if you're buying it pre-made, because no one has 24 hours to sit on it. And then it's, we like things to be a regular size and a regular shape, and that's the beauty of bread, is it's completely variable. It will do exactly what it wants, depending on the weather. The starter may be more active or less. Depending on the season, it will change. The microbes change seasonally. And I think, there was a very good reason for so long it was called the staff of life, because it was nutritious. It did give you what you needed, even if it was not a complete, package. You have the other things too, but you can live on bread. I don't think that's the case now. I think the bread we're eating is, by and large, just a different product. It looks like it, doesn't really taste like it. Okay. So, with that, I want to cut into this thing. And I like breaking bread, but sometimes I like to just play with my toys. So I'm going to cut into it. And I want you to tell me, I have no idea what it tastes like, honestly. This is the first bread this starter has made. So I'm just going to cut some wedges out. And if you want to ask me some questions, see, look at the holes are really nice looking. And I don't know, I'm just going to slice them. But if you have questions, go ahead and shoot, and I will answer while I'm doing this.
What bakery is it from?
Well, this is from my house. I made this morning at 5 o'clock. So if I look a little sleepy.
Is it with your own starter?
Yes.
That baby right there.
And King Arthur flour.
And yeah, the flour I did not grind by hand, unfortunately, but
So is it just wheat, flour?
And a little salt, that's it.
Uh-huh.
Wheat, water, and salt. You could put, you know what, this is taking too long. I'm just going to take it. You could put butter on it, obviously, it'd be great.
I have a question about the...
Here, pass it back.
I have a question about how they stored the grain in the old days, and they don't do that anymore?
Yeah, I think there's not enough plates. So what was the question, how they store the grain?